The North Fork of the Bitterroot drains a watershed that the Forest Service maps as wilderness, but that hunters who have worked it for 20 or 30 years understand is something older than the designation. The ridge above the fork runs at roughly 7,000 feet for about 4 miles before it breaks into a series of benches that step down into the lodgepole and the creek bottom, and those benches hold elk in September the way a good valley holds water. Consistently, season after season, because the terrain and the feed and the security cover are exactly what a mature bull requires when the rut is building. The ridge itself is granite and shale above the timber, with a few isolated subalpine fir stands that cling to the protected faces. And at first light in late September, the skyline from a position on the south bench is the kind of view that people put on calendars and that I have never been able to fully describe to anyone who has not stood in that specific spot at that specific hour. Dark blue above, the last stars pulling back. The ridge in sharp black silhouette against the paling east, and below you the timber still fully dark and the elk beginning to move. Their sounds carrying up through the cold air with a clarity that the lower country never produces. I have hunted that ridge for most of my adult life. I know what belongs there and what does not. I know the sound of a bull working his way down from the high country before light, the particular cadence of hooves on shale, the way a cow alarm barks when she has smelled something and is not yet certain of the direction. I know what a black bear sounds like moving through the lodgepole below the benches at night, and I know the difference between a bear's unhurried travel and the sound of something that is covering ground with urgency. I know what urgency sounds like in that country because I have heard it before, in animals that were trying to get away from something, and I have learned over the years what categories of animal produce, what categories of urgency, and what those categories mean about what is behind them. I want to say that up front, before I get into what happened that September, because I think it matters that this account comes from a man who was not startled by the unfamiliar. I was startled by something that should not have been there, which is a different thing entirely. My hunting partner for the better part of 18 years was a man named Gus Ferreira. We met through work, became friends the way men in their 30s sometimes do when they find someone who shares a specific kind of quietness about certain things. And we hunted that ridge together every September for the better part of 2 decades. Gus died the March before the hunt I am going to describe. Cardiac event, fast, nobody saw it coming. He had been in better shape than me for most of our friendship, and I had privately assumed he would outlive me by a decade, which is the kind of assumption you make about people you are close to because you need them to stay in your future in order to keep going. He did not stay. I went into that September hunt alone for the first time in 18 years, which is a context I am giving you not to color the account, but because the account does not make full sense without it. Grief does things to your attention. It either narrows it to a point or it opens it wider than is comfortable. And what I experienced that September was the second kind. Everything too present, too specific. The country more itself than I remembered it being. The way things become more themselves when you are looking at them for the first time without the person you always looked at them with. The night it happened, I was camped on the south bench at about 6,400 feet. I had been in camp for 4 days, had not fired a shot, had been watching a group of 5 cows and a satellite bull on the bench below every evening without the shooter bull I was waiting for making an appearance. I was not impatient. Patience on that ridge was something Gus had taught me. His phrase for it was that the mountain has a schedule and you are not on it. And I was holding to that even without him there to say it. I woke at somewhere around 2 in the morning. No alarm, nothing I could identify as a cause. I lay in the sleeping bag and listened, and the camp was quiet. The fire I had banked before sleep had gone down to coals, and the only sound was the drainage below and a light wind moving the fir branches above the tent. Standard. Nothing that should have pulled me up. I got out of the bag and pulled on my boots and jacket, which I do when I wake in the backcountry at night because the habit of being dressed is worth the minor inconvenience. And I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The sky was clear and the moon was 3/4 full, and the ridge above my camp was visible in silver-gray detail. The granite face and the timber fringe along the lower bench in good contrast. Cold. Still. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, orienting, letting my eyes adjust fully, and I was about to go back inside when I heard it. From the upper ridge, maybe half a mile north, a sound that I spent the first 3 seconds classifying as elk and then reclassified as wrong. The cadence was elk-like in that it was large animal movement across open ground, multiple animals, weight and pace both significant. But elk moving at night on the upper ridge do not move at that speed. What I was hearing was a sprint, not the burst sprint of an animal that has been startled and is putting distance between itself and a threat before settling back to a trot. A sustained sprint, multiple animals, all moving in the same direction at the same pace, coordinated in a way that elk in flight are not coordinated. Elk scatter. What I was hearing was not scattering. It was a single direction, high-speed departure, and the direction was south, toward my bench, toward lower country, toward the creek bottom. I stood still. I had my headlamp, but I did not turn it on. I had my rifle in the tent, and I did not go back for it, which is a decision I have examined many times since, and which I think was correct because I believe that if I had moved back into the tent, to the rifle, anywhere, I would have missed the window of what I was about to see. Some instinct that I am not fully able to name kept me planted in that spot in the dark. They came over the ridge at a run. Against the moonlit skyline, they were silhouettes, and I want to be precise about what a silhouette tells you and what it does not. It does not give you color, texture, facial detail, eye color, anything that requires proximity or light. What it gives you is shape, proportion, and movement, and those 3 things were sufficient for what I needed to know. There were 4 of them. They came over the ridge at the north end of my visible skyline, and they moved south along the top at a pace that covered ground, the way a running horse covers ground, eating distance, not fighting it, upright. All 4 upright, bipedal, the arm swing and the forward lean of a running biped, not the horizontal driving body of a quadruped at full sprint. The proportions were wrong for people. Too wide at the shoulder, too long in the arm. The heads, and I could see the heads clearly in silhouette against the moonlit sky, were not human, extended forward of the skull in a way that no human head extends. Canine. I have been looking at animal shapes against skylines for 30 years, and I can tell you without hesitation and without qualification that the heads on those 4 silhouettes were canine. They moved south along the ridge for maybe 40 seconds of my visibility before the terrain dropped them below the skyline and they were gone. I stood where I was. I did not hear them hit the bench below my camp. I did not hear them pass through the timber. Either they pulled up short of my position and went to ground in the trees above the bench, or they went through at a speed and a quiet that no large animal I know produces in lodgepole timber in the dark. Both options are worth sitting with. I want to dwell on the behavioral component of what I observed because it is the part that has stayed with me longer than the visual. A pack of dogmen. And I am using that word plainly, without the hedging I used for the first 2 years when I told pieces of this to people I trusted. A pack of dogmen running at full speed in coordinated single-direction flight across an exposed ridgeline at 2 in the morning is a behavioral event with a specific meaning. Animals do not run at full speed across exposed terrain in the dark unless the calculation they have made is that the cost of exposure is lower than the cost of staying in cover. Whatever was behind them had made cover untenable. The pack had decided that moving fast in the open was the better option. That decision tells you something about what was behind them, about its persistence, about its ability to operate in cover that 4 large bipedal canines found untenable, about whatever hierarchy operates on that ridge at night. I am a wildlife biologist by training, though I have been working in land management for the last 15 years and the field work is mostly behind me. I know what predator-prey dynamics look like in the behavioral record. I know the difference between an animal that is fleeing a specific threat and an animal that is running because another animal ran. What I watched on that ridgeline was not contagion panic. It was directed, coordinated, purposeful flight by 4 animals that knew where they were going and why. The thing behind them was real and they knew it was behind them and they had decided on a direction and they were executing. There is another behavioral element I have not seen discussed in any account I have read of Dogman sightings. And I want to put it on record here because I think it matters. The pack moved in a specific formation. The 2 lead animals were slightly ahead and wider apart, almost flanking each other, while the 2 trailing animals ran in tighter, closer together, slightly behind the lead pair. That is a formation that wolves use when moving through territory they do not control. The lead animals reading the ground ahead while the trailing pair watch the flanks and rear. It is not a panicked scatter. It is a tactical withdrawal by animals that have enough cognitive architecture to maintain formation under extreme stress. I watched 4 bipedal canines execute a military-style retreat across a Montana ridgeline at 2 in the morning, and I have been a field biologist long enough to know that formation behavior under flight conditions represents a level of social coordination that we do not attribute to any known North American predator outside of wolf packs. And even wolf formation behavior is less consistent under active flight than what I observed. That coordination is what I kept coming back to in the months after. Not the size, not the shape, the formation. Something had threatened those 4 animals badly enough to drive them off the high country in the dark, and they had responded not with individual flight but with a coordinated tactical response. Whatever drove them understood that. Whatever was behind them on that ridge was dealing with something that could think under pressure, and it had still driven them off. I waited. I stood in my camp in the cold for what I believe was close to an hour, listening to the ridge, watching the skyline, not going back inside. The cold was significant by then. Mid-September at 6,400 feet drops hard after midnight, and I was standing in camp clothes without my insulated layer, and my hands were cold enough to be clumsy by the 40-minute mark. I noticed that, and I did not go inside. That is worth noting because I am not a man who ignores physical discomfort as a rule. 30 years of mountain hunting teaches you to manage your body or the mountain manages it for you. And the fact that I stood there with cold hands and did not move tells you something about the quality of attention I was bringing to that skyline. I was also, somewhere in that hour, aware of the specific solitude of the situation. Not loneliness exactly. I have spent more time alone in backcountry than most people spend in any one place. And solitude in the field has never bothered me. This was the awareness that if something came over that ridge at me, there was nobody within 10 miles who would hear anything, and nobody who would know to look for me for 3 more days, and that the calculation the pack had made, exposed ground over compromised cover, might become relevant to my own situation in a way I had not considered before stepping out of the tent. I am not a man who dwells in that kind of thinking. I registered it, noted it, and kept watching the ridge. But I registered it. At some point in that hour, I became aware that I was thinking about Gus. Not in the sharp way grief sometimes arrives mid-activity. More like a presence alongside me, the way he would have been alongside me if he had been there. He would have been still too. He would not have reached for the rifle and he would not have said anything, and he would have been watching the same skyline with the same quality of attention that I was bringing to it alone. That is the kind of hunting partner he was. The kind of quiet that does not require filling. Nothing else came over the ridge. Whatever had been driving those 4 animals south did not appear on my skyline. whether it pulled back into the high country, whether it went to ground somewhere in the drainage above the bench, whether it moved through on a line I could not see. I do not know. What I know is that I watched the ridge for an hour in the cold and nothing showed itself, and when I eventually went back inside, I lay in the bag with my rifle unzipped from its case and beside me until the sky began to pale and I did not sleep. I left camp the following morning. I had 2 days left on my permit and I left anyway, which is the only time in 30 years of hunting the Bitterroot that I have packed out before my time was up. I told myself I was low on food, which was partially true. I told the outfitter I ran into at the trailhead that it had been slow and I wanted to beat the weather coming in from the northwest, which was also partially true. What I did not say was that when dawn came and I climbed up to the south bench to glass the lower timber, the elk were gone. Not just the group I had been watching, all of them. The bench that had been holding cows and the satellite bull every evening for 4 days was empty, the grass undisturbed, no fresh tracks in the soft ground at the seep where they watered before light. They had cleared out in the night, not just moved to a different part of the bench, left the drainage entirely in the way that elk leave country when something has fundamentally altered the safety calculation of that terrain. I have seen elk abandon a drainage after a grizzly makes a kill in it. I have seen them clear a bench after a cougar takes a calf at the water. Both times it took 3 to 4 days before any animals came back, and they came back cautious, testing the air at every step. Whatever happened on that ridge the night before had cleared the upper drainage of every ungulate in it. The pack had run south into the lower country. The elk had gone. I do not know which direction. The shale above the bench does not hold tracks. And whatever had driven the pack had stayed up in the high country or gone somewhere I could not read. The drainage felt empty in the specific way it feels when the animals that know the country better than you have made a collective decision that it is not safe, and you are the last one there who has not received that information through the correct channels. I broke camp. I do not regret it. Not dangerous exactly. Occupied in a way I had not understood it to be occupied before, with a hierarchy I was not positioned in the way I had always assumed I was positioned. I have been back twice since. Both times I felt the difference. It is not a feeling I can describe with precision. More like the specific awareness that the place you are in has its own purposes and that your purposes, which you thought were the central purposes, are peripheral to it. The elk are still there. The ridge is still what it was in September at first light. I still know where the bulls bed and where the cows water and how the wind moves through the bench timber at different hours of the day. That knowledge is intact. What changed is my understanding of what else knows those things and has known them longer and is better positioned in that country than I will ever be. The last thing I will say is about what that night cost me, separate from the encounter itself. I have hunted that ridge every September for 30 years. It was the place I went to be the version of myself that Gus knew. The version that was patient and quiet and competent in country that asked something of you. That version of myself is still accessible up there. But it is now always accompanied by the awareness of what I saw on the skyline, and by the question I have not been able to answer in the years since, which is not what the 4 animals were. I have a sufficient answer to that, but what it was that drove them, that question does not have an answer I can give you. It does not have an answer I can give myself. It lives in the ridge the way certain questions live in certain places, and it will be there the next time I go up and the time after that. And I have made a kind of peace with that, even though the peace is not entirely comfortable. Some things in the high country are not ours to resolve. We are visitors up there, and what I watched on the ridgeline confirmed that the visitation goes further than I had understood, and that the prior occupants include things that even the dogmen move away from at full speed in the dark. Subscribe. Whatever was at that tree line is still out there. Leave your region in the comments. If you hunt the northern Rockies, the Bitterroot, the Beaverhead, drop where you are below.